2 years ago, my father stood up at Christmas dinner, raised a glass in front of 14 relatives, and called me the failed result of contraception. A year later, those same people were sitting in silence while millions watched me on national television. So how did the daughter my parents once tried to erase end up building a life the whole country was applauding? My name is Dolores Wright. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a speech therapist. Most days, my job is helping children learn how to find their voices, kids who struggle to speak clearly, kids who were born with conditions that make communication harder for them than it is for most people. But the truth is, this story isn't really about my career. It's about something much deeper. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you the most spend your entire life making you feel like you shouldn't exist. And it's about how sometimes the family you build can become stronger than the one you were born into. To explain that, I need to take you back to a moment that still echoes in my head whenever I think about the word family. Christmas Eve. My parents' house in Edina, Minnesota. The kind of house that looks like it belongs in a magazine white colonial, circular driveway, warm lights glowing through tall windows. The kind of house that quietly tells the world, we succeeded. 14 people were sitting around the dining table that night. My parents at the center. My sister Victoria and her husband Preston. My brother Christopher and his wife Amanda. Their kids. My uncle Paul and his wife. And my grandmother, Ruth, who was already 85 and slowly losing pieces of her memory to dementia. The table looked perfect. Crystal glasses. White candles. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, all arranged exactly the way my mother had been arranging them every Christmas for as long as I could remember. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people put on Christmas cards. But I had spent 31 years knowing that I didn't really belong in that picture. Halfway through dinner, my father stood up. He tapped his fork gently against his glass. The room went quiet. That was normal. My father loved making toasts. He was Dr. Thomas Wright, an orthopedic surgeon who had spent his entire career fixing bones and building a reputation that meant everything to him. He smiled at the table. Then he looked directly at me. "Let's all be grateful for family tonight," he said. A few people nodded politely. Then he added, casually, almost like he was sharing a funny story. "Though Linda and I used to joke that Dolores was the failed result of contraception." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. For half a second, nobody moved. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. My mother laughed too. It wasn't the first time my existence had been treated like a punchline. But something about hearing it said that clearly, in front of 14 people, still felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under me. Before I could even process it, my brother Christopher leaned back in his chair and added something else. "Well, at least nowadays," he said, smiling, "if contraception fails, there are other options." He didn't say the word, but everyone understood what he meant. A few people laughed again. Others stared at their plates. My grandmother looked confused. And I sat there quietly, my fork resting on the edge of my plate, realizing something strange. I wasn't shocked. Not really, because the truth is, that joke wasn't new. It was just the most honest version of something my parents had been telling me my entire life. I was born in September 1993, 2 months premature. My body arrived in the world already fighting. Club feet, partial hearing loss in my left ear, a list of complications that required surgeries, therapy appointments, and medical charts thicker than most children ever have. In most families, those things might have made a child feel fragile, maybe even precious. In my family, they made me feel like a problem. My father believed in efficiency, in perfection, in results that justified the effort. And I was none of those things. I didn't fully understand how my parents felt about me until I was 14. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in 2008. My father had asked me to wait in his office at the clinic while he finished with a patient. He told me to sit quietly. But teenagers are curious creatures, especially when they grow up in houses full of things that feel just slightly out of reach. His filing cabinet was open. One drawer, just a little. And inside that drawer were folders labeled with family documents, tax forms, insurance papers, college acceptance letters for my sister. scholarship certificates for my brother. Then I saw one folder with a label that stopped me cold. It didn't say Dolores Wright. It just said Dolores. Inside was a medical chart dated March 15th, 1994. I was 6 months old at the time. The document listed my parents' names under guardians present. Then there was a handwritten note. My father's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The note said, "Parents considering relinquishment due to financial and emotional burden of multiple congenital anomalies." I stared at that sentence for a long time, 14 years old, trying to understand what I was reading. They had considered giving me up, not because they couldn't feed me, not because they didn't have a home, but because I was too complicated, too expensive, too imperfect. My hands shook so badly that it took 3 tries before I managed to take a clear picture of the document with my phone. I shoved the folder back into the cabinet just seconds before my father walked back into the room. He asked if I was ready to go home. I said yes. We drove home in silence. And I never told him what I had found. But that photo stayed on my phone. For 17 years, a quiet reminder of something I already suspected. In my family, love had conditions. Victoria was the perfect daughter. Christopher was the future success story. And me? I was the thing that went wrong. The daughter who survived when, according to that chart, my parents once seriously considered another option. By the time I turned 18, I understood the rules of our house. If you were successful, you were celebrated. If you were inconvenient, you were tolerated. Victoria's IVF treatments cost nearly $30,000. My parents paid the entire bill without hesitation. When I needed a new hearing aid that cost $3,600, my mother told me I should learn responsibility and save for it myself. So I worked 2 jobs that summer and bought it on my own. That's when something inside me changed. Not in an angry way, more like a quiet realization. I might never be the daughter my parents wanted, but someday, I would build a life they could never take away from me. At the time, I didn't know how that would happen. I didn't know it would start in a church basement with a 10-year-old boy that nobody else wanted. And I definitely didn't know that one day 8 children would call me mom, or that millions of strangers would watch the story of my life unfold on national television. But the first step toward that future had already begun. And it started the moment I stopped trying to prove my worth to the people who had already decided I didn't have any. For most of my life, I believed family was something you were either lucky enough to be born into or unlucky enough to survive. After that Christmas dinner, after the years of quiet rejection that came before it, I stopped expecting my parents to ever see me differently. I stopped hoping for apologies that were never going to come. Instead, I focused on something much smaller and much more manageable, building a life that functioned without them. By 2019, I was 25 years old. I had finished my degree in speech therapy and started working full-time at a rehabilitation clinic in Minneapolis. Most of my patients were children, kids who struggled with speech delays, hearing impairments, or neurological conditions that made communication difficult. I spent my days helping them pronounce words that most people take for granted. Watching a child finally say their own name clearly for the first time can feel like witnessing a miracle. The work was exhausting, but it meant something. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was contributing something real to the world. Outside of work, my life was quiet. I lived in a small apartment with thin walls and an old heater that clicked loudly every time it turned on. My furniture didn't match, and most of it came from thrift stores or Facebook Marketplace, but the place was mine. It was the first space I had ever lived in where I didn't feel like I had to apologize for existing. Still, there was a question that kept returning to me late at night. What does a person do when they realize their own family doesn't want them? For a while, I tried pretending that question didn't matter. But eventually, it pushed me somewhere unexpected. A support group. Every Thursday evening, in the basement of a small church about 10 minutes from my apartment, a group of people gathered to talk about life with disabilities, our own, or those of the people we cared for. I didn't start going because I needed emotional support. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was a little different. I wanted to understand something. Growing up, I had always believed my parents were right, that maybe my medical issues had made life harder for them, that maybe my existence had complicated their plans in ways I couldn't fully see. But sitting in that church basement week after week, listening to other people talk about their lives, I started noticing something. Most of them had experienced the same thing I had: rejection. Doctors who spoke about them like problems to be solved, teachers who assumed they wouldn't succeed, parents who quietly wished for easier children. The stories were different, but the feeling was always the same: being treated like an inconvenience instead of a person. One Thursday night in late October, the meeting started like any other. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee in a metal pot that had clearly been reheated more than once, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. About halfway through the meeting, a woman named Janet stood up. Janet worked for the county foster care system. She had short gray hair and the permanent tired expression of someone who had spent years dealing with bureaucracy and heartbreak in equal measure. "I usually don't do this," she said, holding a photo in her hand. "But we have a situation." Everyone in the room went quiet. "There's a boy," she continued, 10 years old, Mobius syndrome. A few people in the group nodded. I had heard of it before. Mobius syndrome affects the facial nerves, making it difficult or impossible for someone to move the muscles in their face. Many children with the condition can't smile or show expression in the way people expect. Janet continued speaking. "He's been in 8 foster homes over the last 5 years. 8. That number landed heavily in the room. "Every family sends him back," she said softly. "They say he's difficult. Some say he scares their other children. Others just say they can't connect with him." She hesitated before adding the part that stayed with me. "Most of them say it's hard to look at him." She passed the photograph around the circle. When it reached me, I held it longer than anyone else. The boy had dark hair that fell messily across his forehead. His eyes were large and alert, watching the camera with a kind of quiet caution. His face was completely still, almost like a mask, but his eyes held something that made my chest tighten. He looked like someone who had already learned not to expect kindness. I recognized that look immediately, because I had worn it myself for most of my childhood. I looked up at Janet. "What's his name?" I asked. "Benjamin Torres." The room stayed silent. Foster care is complicated. Everyone in that circle understood that children with complex medical needs require enormous patience and resources. Most people were there to support someone else, not necessarily to become foster parents themselves. Janet didn't push anyone. She simply said, "We're trying to find a placement where he won't be moved again." Something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic feeling, not lightning or destiny, just a quiet, stubborn thought that refused to leave. 8 families had already told this boy he wasn't worth the effort. I raised my hand. "I want to meet him." Janet studied me carefully, the way people do when they're trying to decide whether you understand the seriousness of what you're offering. "Foster parenting isn't easy," she said gently, "especially with kids who've experienced this level of rejection." "I know," I replied. And I did know, at least in one important way. I knew what it felt like to grow up believing you were the problem. The process started the following week. Becoming a foster parent requires more than good intentions. There were background checks, financial evaluations, home inspections, and 40 hours of training classes that stretched across several months. I spent my evenings sitting in classrooms with other prospective foster parents, learning about trauma-informed care, behavioral strategies, and the complicated legal framework surrounding child welfare. During the day, I continued working at the clinic. At night, I studied foster care manuals and filled out paperwork. My second bedroom, which had mostly been used for storage, slowly transformed into something else. I bought a twin bed and assembled it myself, cursing quietly at the instruction manual. I found a used dresser at a thrift store and repainted it. I installed shelves along one wall and filled them with books, small toys, and a few speech therapy tools that might help if Benjamin wanted to use them. Janet mentioned that Benjamin liked the color blue, so I painted the walls blue. It took me an entire weekend and more paint than I expected, but when it was finished, the room looked calm and welcoming in a way the rest of my apartment never had. 6 months after that first meeting in the church basement, Janet called me. "You've been approved," she said. I remember sitting on my couch, staring at the wall as the words settled in. Benjamin was scheduled to arrive the next afternoon. At exactly 2 o'clock the following day, Janet knocked on my apartment door. Benjamin stood behind her, holding a black garbage bag filled with everything he owned. He was smaller than I expected for a 10-year-old. He didn't look up when I introduced myself. "Hi, Benjamin," I said gently. "I'm Dolores." He nodded once. His eyes briefly scanned the room before dropping back to the floor. Janet stayed for about an hour, going through paperwork and final instructions. Benjamin barely spoke the entire time. When Janet finally left, the apartment felt strangely quiet. I turned toward him. "Do you want to see your room?" He nodded again. When we walked into the blue bedroom, he stopped in the doorway and looked around slowly. His eyes moved from the bed to the shelves to the small desk in the corner. He placed the garbage bag on the floor. Then he asked a question in a flat, practiced voice. "Which room is mine?" I pointed to the one we were standing in. "This one." He looked around again, as if trying to understand something. Then he asked the second question that so many foster children learn to ask. "When do I leave?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Because that question carried the weight of 8 other homes that had already answered it. Finally, I knelt down so we were eye level. "You don't," I said quietly. "You're staying." Benjamin studied my face for several seconds, searching for something. Then he nodded once and stepped inside the room. That night, after dinner, I heard him crying softly behind the bedroom door, the kind of crying someone does when they're trying very hard not to be heard. I didn't go in, not because I didn't care, but because I understood something important. Sometimes the first step toward trust is simply giving someone the space to believe you might stay. The first few weeks after Benjamin moved in were quieter than I expected. Not difficult in the way people had warned me, not chaotic or dramatic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when two people are trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without hurting each other. Benjamin barely spoke during those first days. He followed routines carefully, almost like he had memorized how to behave in other people's houses. Wake up, eat breakfast, sit at the table, go to school, come home, homework, dinner, bed. Everything he did was cautious. He walked softly, like someone who expected to be told he was making too much noise. When he finished eating, he would quietly carry his plate to the sink without being asked. Sometimes I would find him sitting in the living room, hands folded in his lap, waiting for instructions that never came. It took me a while to understand that this was how survival looked for him. On the third morning, I made pancakes. Nothing fancy, just the boxed mix from the grocery store, but the smell filled the kitchen in a way that made the apartment feel warmer. Benjamin walked out of his room slowly and sat at the table, watching me cook. I placed a plate in front of him. He stared at it for a moment. Then he looked up at me for the first time since arriving. "When are you sending me back?" he asked. The question was so calm, so practiced, that it hit me harder than if he had shouted it. I set the spatula down. "Never," I said. He kept staring at me, studying my face carefully. "I mean it," I added. "You're not going anywhere." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes filled with tears. His face didn't move much. Mobius syndrome makes it difficult for his facial muscles to show expression, but his eyes said everything. He cried. Janet had told me later that Benjamin hadn't cried in front of anyone in almost 2 years. I didn't try to comfort him with words. I simply sat beside him and let him cry until he was ready to breathe normally again. After a while, he wiped his face with his sleeve and whispered one small word. "Okay." That was the moment our house stopped being a placement and started becoming something else. Something closer to a home. A few days later, I made a decision that, in hindsight, probably changed everything. I called my mother. I don't know exactly what I expected from that conversation. Maybe some part of me still believed that if my parents saw me doing something meaningful, helping a child who needed stability, they might finally understand me. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Hello?" "Hi, Mom," I said carefully. "I wanted to tell you something." "What is it?" "I became a foster parent," I explained. There's a 10-year-old boy living with me now. His name is Benjamin. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke again. A foster child? She said slowly. Yes. Another pause. Then her voice changed. Dolores, why would you do that? The way she asked the question made it sound less like curiosity and more like disbelief. Because he needs someone, I replied. He's been moved between 8 different homes. What's wrong with him? She asked. He has Mobius syndrome, I said. Facial paralysis. Silence again. Then she said something that I still remember word for word. A facially deformed child? Her voice had turned sharp. Dolores, you already have your own issues. Why would you take on more defects? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Something inside my chest cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, final way. He's not defective, I said slowly. He's a kid. My mother sighed impatiently. Well, she said, don't bring him to family events. I mean it. The call lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I know the exact length because after it ended, I sat on the couch, staring at the clock. Benjamin was in the other room working on homework. He didn't know that in those 4 minutes, the last fragile thread connecting me to my parents had just snapped. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. You're choosing broken strangers over your own blood. Don't expect us at your funeral. I read the message 3 times. Then I took a screenshot. I saved it in a folder on my phone. I labeled that folder Receipts. Not because I was planning revenge, but because I had spent too many years being told that I misunderstood things, that I was overly sensitive, that I imagined insults that weren't really there. Screenshots don't argue. After saving it, I replied with a single word. Noted. The message showed as delivered. She never opened it. The next morning I tried calling my father. The call went straight to voicemail. Blocked. My sister Victoria sent one message later that afternoon. Mom says you've cut the family off too. I'm sorry. That was it. Christopher didn't call at all. I sent him a message asking if we could talk. He saw it. He never replied. Within a week, my family had disappeared from my life as completely as if they had moved to another country. At first, the silence felt strange. For years, my parents had been a constant presence in the background of my life, even if most of that presence was criticism or disappointment. Without them, the world felt quieter, but also clearer. One evening, about 2 weeks after Benjamin moved in, I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through paperwork when he looked up from a coloring book. Why don't you have family photos? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I glanced around the apartment. He was right. There weren't any. For a moment, I considered giving him a vague answer. Something simple. Something easy. But Benjamin deserved honesty. So I closed the folder in front of me and sat down beside him. I do have family now, I said. He looked confused. You're in it. Benjamin didn't respond immediately. He went back to coloring quietly, but I noticed something small change in his posture. The tension in his shoulders softened, as if a tiny part of him had decided to believe me. Life settled into a rhythm after that. School in the mornings. Speech therapy exercises at the kitchen table in the afternoons. Sometimes we watched movies together in the evenings, Benjamin sitting on one end of the couch while I graded paperwork from the clinic. Little by little, he started talking more. Not a lot, but enough. One afternoon he told me his favorite color was blue. Another time he admitted he liked dinosaurs but had stopped collecting them because the last family threw his toys away when they sent him back. So we went to a thrift store and bought 3 plastic dinosaurs for $2. He lined them up carefully on the windowsill in his room. A week later, he asked if he could keep them there permanently. Yes, I said. You can keep them forever. That word forever made him smile in the only way he could. A tiny shift in his eyes. A softening around his mouth. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. And it was the first time I realized something important. I had spent my entire childhood wishing someone would choose me. Now, somehow, I had become the person who could choose someone else. And that choice was about to change everything. Because Benjamin was only the beginning. Soon, another child would arrive at our door. And another. And another. until the quiet apartment where I once lived alone would slowly transform into a house filled with voices, wheelchairs, therapy schedules, laughter, and chaos. A house that, for the first time in my life, truly felt like family. Life didn't change all at once after Benjamin arrived. It happened slowly, almost quietly, the way seasons change when you're not really paying attention. One day you realize the air feels different, the light looks softer, and the life you used to have has somehow become something else entirely. Benjamin had been with me for about a year when the next call came. It was Janet again. By then, she had become more than just the social worker who brought a child to my door. She was someone who checked in occasionally, someone who understood the strange mixture of exhaustion and joy that came with caring for children who had already learned too much about disappointment. Her voice on the phone sounded careful. "We have a girl," she said, 8 years old. I waited for the rest. "Club feet," Janet continued. "Scoliosis. She's been in the system since she was 4. Her birth parents surrendered custody when the medical bills became too much." Something twisted inside my chest when she said the words, "club feet." The same condition I had been born with. "What's her name?" I asked quietly. "Hannah Jones." 3 days later, I met her. Hannah was smaller than most 8-year-olds, with 2 tight braids that hung down over her shoulders. She walked with a slight limp, a movement so familiar to me that it almost felt like looking into a mirror from 20 years earlier. When she stepped into my living room, Benjamin sat on the couch watching her with the cautious curiosity of someone who understood exactly what it meant to arrive somewhere new. The social worker stayed for a while, explaining routines and paperwork, but eventually she stepped outside to take a call, leaving Hannah and me alone for a few minutes. Hannah looked down at my feet. Then she looked at her own. "You walk like me," she said. I smiled gently. "I do," I told her. "I was born with club feet too." Her eyes widened slightly. "Did they fix yours?" "Mostly," I said. "It took a lot of doctors and a lot of time, but yeah, they helped." She nodded slowly, thinking about that. Then she asked the same question Benjamin had asked me the first week he arrived. "Are you going to send me back?" My heart tightened. "No," I said softly. "I'm not." She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to measure whether those words meant anything. Then she gave a small nod and sat down beside Benjamin on the couch. Neither of them spoke, but they sat together quietly, watching the same cartoon. And in that quiet moment, something began to form between them. A kind of understanding that only children who have both been unwanted can share. Hannah officially moved in a week later. The first month was slow and careful. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the guarded tone of someone who expected things to change again soon. Benjamin became the unexpected bridge between us. He showed her where the extra blankets were kept. He explained which cereal boxes were okay to open. He told her that Thursday nights meant pizza and movies. Sometimes, they sat together doing homework at the kitchen table, both of them concentrating so hard it looked like they were solving national security problems instead of elementary school math. About 6 weeks after Hannah arrived, something happened that I will never forget. I was standing at the sink, washing dishes when she walked into the kitchen. She stood there quietly for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. Then the words came out quickly. "Can I call you Mom?" The plate in my hand slipped slightly in the soap bubbles. For a second I couldn't speak. "If you want to," I said finally. Her shoulders relaxed in a way that told me how much courage that question had taken. "I want to," she said. That night I sat on the couch long after the kids went to bed, staring at the quiet living room. I realized something profound had just happened. The girl my parents once considered giving away had just been chosen as someone's mother. And that choice was about to grow bigger than I ever imagined. Over the next few years, our small family expanded. Elijah arrived next. He was 9 years old and had Down syndrome. When he first came to us, he barely spoke at all. Words seemed trapped somewhere inside him, and it took months of patient speech therapy before he started forming sentences. But once he found his voice, Elijah had a laugh that filled entire rooms. Then came Sophia. She had Treacher-Collins syndrome and partial hearing loss in one ear, something that created an instant bond between us. She asked endless questions about hearing aids, about surgeries, about what life might look like when she grew up. Jacob joined us the following year. He had cerebral palsy and used a mobility walker. His determination was unbelievable. Watching him cross a room, step by step, with absolute stubborn focus, was like witnessing a daily act of courage. By 2024, the apartment that once felt spacious now felt impossibly small. There were wheelchairs in the hallway, therapy schedules on the refrigerator, stacks of medical paperwork covering the kitchen counter. Eventually, I had to make a decision that terrified me. I bought a house. Not a big one, just a modest four-bedroom place on the edge of the city, but it felt enormous compared to the apartment. The mortgage was $279,000. The monthly payment was $2,100. My salary as a speech therapist was around $52,000 a year. On weekends, I tutored children who needed extra help with language development, earning another $12,000 annually. On paper, the math didn't make sense. The medical expenses alone for several children with complex needs could easily reach six figures every year. But somehow, month by month, we kept moving forward. Medicaid helped. Nonprofit grants helped. And sometimes, strangers helped. The real turning point came when Pastor Brooks from the church visited one afternoon. He found me asleep on the couch at 3 in the afternoon, completely exhausted, while the kids played quietly nearby. When I woke up, he sat down beside me. "Dolores," he said gently, "you don't have to do this alone." I laughed softly. "I'm not alone," I told him. "I have them." He nodded. "Yes," he said, "but they also deserve a community." Within 2 weeks, he organized a rotating group of volunteers from the church. 23 people. Some helped drive kids to doctor appointments. Some cooked meals. Some came over simply to read books or help with homework so I could take a shower without someone knocking on the door. The first time someone arrived with a full dinner already prepared, I nearly cried. Not because of the food, but because for the first time in my life, people were helping me simply because they cared. By the end of that year, our house was louder, messier, and more chaotic than anything I had ever experienced growing up. But it was also warmer, suffer, real. And I thought, maybe for the first time, that the past had finally stopped chasing me. But life has a strange way of bringing unfinished stories back around. Because just as our family reached its fullest, most fragile balance, a message appeared on my phone. The first message from my mother in almost 5 years. It was December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. And it simply said, "Family dinner, Christmas Eve, 6:30, don't be late." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend it had never arrived. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, and probably more hopeful than it should have been, wondered something dangerous. Maybe they had changed. Maybe they had seen the life I built. Maybe they wanted to reconnect. So I said yes. And 3 days later, I walked back into the house where my story had first begun. I had no idea that the dinner waiting for me there would become the moment that changed everything. 3 days after my mother's message appeared on my phone, I found myself standing in front of the house where I had grown up. It was Christmas Eve again. The same tall windows glowing with warm light, the same circular driveway dusted with snow, the same quiet neighborhood where every house looked like it had been designed to prove something about success. I sat in my car for a minute before getting out, hands resting on the steering wheel, wondering why my heart was beating so fast. I told myself I wasn't hoping for anything. I told myself I was just being polite, closing a chapter properly, but the truth was harder to admit. Some part of me, the stubborn part that still remembered being a child at that table, wondered if maybe they had changed. I had brought a bottle of wine. It cost $35, which was more than I should have spent, but it felt like the kind of thing people brought to family dinners. I rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door almost immediately. She looked older than the last time I had seen her, though maybe that was just time catching up with both of us. "You made it," she said. Not, "It's good to see you." Not, "We missed you." Just, "You made it." I handed her the wine. She took it without looking at the label and stepped aside so I could walk in. The house smelled exactly the same: rosemary, roasted turkey, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon candles. For a moment, I felt like I had stepped backward in time. The dining room table was already set. 14 seats. My father sat at the head of the table like he always had. My mother took the chair beside him. Victoria and her husband Preston sat with their 2 children. Christopher and Amanda were there too, their daughter sitting quietly beside them. My uncle Paul and his wife filled 2 more seats. And at the far end of the table sat my grandmother Ruth, her small frame wrapped in a pale cardigan, her eyes wandering slowly across the room. The empty chair beside her was mine. I walked over and sat down. No one hugged me. No one asked how I had been. Christopher gave a short nod, the kind people exchange with coworkers in an elevator. Victoria offered a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Grandma Ruth leaned toward me slowly, as if she were sharing a secret. "You're the only good one, sweetie," she whispered. Her voice trembled slightly with age. I wasn't sure if anyone else heard her, but no one reacted. Dinner began. My mother moved around the table, placing food on each plate with the efficiency she had perfected over decades of hosting these gatherings. When she reached my seat, she skipped past it without pausing. For a moment, the absence hung there quietly. Then I simply reached across the table and served myself. The conversation around me continued as if nothing had happened. Victoria talked about her kids' private school. Preston mentioned something about venture capital investments. Christopher discussed a new project at work. I ate quietly, listening, realizing how familiar this strange distance felt. About halfway through dinner, Victoria's daughter looked up at me curiously. She was 11, old enough to ask questions without realizing how sharp they might sound. "Mom," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "why does Aunt Dolores look different?" The table went still. Victoria flushed slightly. "Honey, but really," the girl continued innocently, "why does she walk funny? And why is her ear like that?" No one spoke. I could feel the attention of every person at the table shift toward me. My father cleared his throat softly. Christopher studied his plate as if the mashed potatoes contained complex mathematical formulas. I looked at the girl and smiled gently. "I was born with some medical conditions," I explained calmly. "Club feet, hearing loss. It just means my body works a little differently." She nodded slowly, considering that. "Oh," she said. Then she returned to her dinner, apparently satisfied. The conversation resumed, but something in the room had changed. And then my father stood up. He lifted his glass and tapped it lightly with his fork. The sound cut through the room. "I'd like to make a toast," he said. This was a familiar ritual. My father loved speeches. In his world, words were tools used to demonstrate authority. He smiled as he looked around the table. "Let's all take a moment to appreciate family this Christmas," he began. Several people nodded politely. Then his eyes landed on me. "Though Linda and I used to joke that Dolores here," he said lightly, "was the failed result of contraception." For a moment, the room froze. Then someone laughed. Another person joined in. My mother laughed too. The sound felt strangely distant, as if I were hearing it through water. My brother leaned back in his chair. "Well," Christopher added casually, "if contraception fails nowadays, there are better options." He didn't say the word. He didn't have to. The implication sat heavily in the room. 8 people laughed. 3 people looked down. Grandma Ruth frowned in confusion. And my mother smiled like this was all part of the evening's entertainment. I placed my fork down carefully beside my plate. Something inside me felt incredibly calm. Not angry. Not shocked. Just finished. I stood up. Every head turned toward me. "Interesting joke, Dad," I said quietly. My voice surprised even me with how steady it sounded. "Merry Christmas." I picked up my coat from the chair behind me and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No one called after me except my grandmother. "Sweetie," she said softly, "where are you going?" No one answered her. Outside, the cold air hit my face as I stepped onto the driveway. Snow crunched under my shoes as I walked to my car. I sat there for a moment before turning the key in the ignition. The drive home took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to replay the scene in my head. 40 minutes to realize something important. I didn't feel humiliated anymore. I felt free. When I arrived at my house, the lights were still on. The babysitter was sitting on the couch with all the kids gathered around the television watching a movie. The moment I stepped through the door, several heads turned. Sophia ran toward me first. "Mama D," she shouted happily. She wrapped her arms around my waist. "Did they love you?" she asked. Children ask questions in the most direct ways. I knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Not the way you do, baby," I said gently. She seemed satisfied with that answer. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of wind against the windows. I didn't cry. I had cried enough over that family years ago. Instead, I made a decision. If they ever tried to come back into my life again, they would meet someone very different from the daughter they had spent decades dismissing. They would meet someone who had already found a family worth protecting. On January 2nd, I blocked my parents' phone numbers. I removed them from every emergency contact form, deleted the last remaining photographs I had saved from childhood. Benjamin noticed the change a few days later during breakfast. "Are we enough for you?" he asked quietly. I looked around the table at all the faces staring back at me. Benjamin, Hannah, Elijah, Sophia, Jacob, the twins, Amelia, my entire world. "You're everything," I said. Benjamin nodded slowly and returned to his cereal. Life continued. But what I didn't know then was that the quiet life we had built inside those walls was about to be seen by millions of people. Because 2 weeks later, something unexpected arrived in my email inbox. An invitation that would take me all the way to New York City and change the way the world saw my story forever. 2 weeks after I blocked my parents' numbers, something unexpected appeared in my inbox. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon. The kids were at school, the house was finally quiet, and I was sitting at the kitchen table catching up on paperwork from the clinic when my email notification popped up. At first, I almost ignored it. The subject line read, "CNN Heroes Nomination." My first thought was that it had to be spam. Messages like that don't usually land in the inbox of a speech therapist raising 8 medically complex foster kids in a modest house outside Minneapolis. But curiosity made me open it. The message explained that someone had nominated me for the CNN Heroes program, an annual recognition of people making a difference in their communities. The nomination had been submitted by Pastor Brooks. I sat there reading the email 3 times before it fully sank in. Apparently, he had written about the house, about the kids, about the years of fostering children who had been rejected by other homes. The message said the producers wanted to learn more about our story. When the kids got home that afternoon, I told them about it. Benjamin was the first to react. He raised an eyebrow and asked, "Does that mean you're famous now?" I laughed. "No, it just means someone asked questions." But inside, I was nervous. Our life was quiet. We had routines, therapy schedules, homework time, bedtime stories. The idea of cameras showing up felt strange. Still, a part of me thought about something Pastor Brooks had said once. Sometimes people need to see what love looks like in real life. 3 weeks later, a small camera crew arrived at the house. They filmed our morning chaos, 8 kids trying to get ready for school at the same time. Shoes missing, backpacks everywhere, Elijah insisting on wearing mismatched socks because he said it made him run faster. They filmed therapy exercises at the kitchen table and the way Sophia tilted her head slightly when adjusting her hearing aid. They asked me questions about my childhood, about Benjamin's first night in our home, about the moment Hannah asked if she could call me Mom. One afternoon, the producer paused during the interview and asked carefully, "Do your parents know about any of this?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "They're not part of my life." She nodded politely and didn't press further, but I later learned that when stories like this air on national television, the producers sometimes reach out to family members anyway. It's part of how they build the full picture of someone's life. I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that in December of 2025, I was invited to New York City for the live event. None of us had ever been to New York before. The kids were so excited they could barely sleep the night before our flight. At the airport, they pressed their faces against the windows, watching airplanes take off, as if we were about to step into an entirely different world. Madison Square Garden was enormous. When we arrived backstage, everything felt surreal. Lights hanging from high metal beams, technicians rushing around with clipboards, makeup artists moving quickly between dressing rooms. Someone led me into a chair and began brushing powder across my face while explaining the order of the show. "You'll go on about 15 minutes after the program starts," she said. "Anderson Cooper will introduce you." The name alone made my stomach twist. Around 5 o'clock, one of the producers returned with a slightly apologetic expression. "There's something we should mention," she said gently. "We invited your family." My heart dropped. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your parents. Your siblings. They're in the audience tonight." I stared at her. "I didn't approve that," I said quietly. "I know," she replied. "But for stories like this, it's standard protocol." For a moment I considered walking out. I imagined taking the kids back to the hotel, ordering pizza, pretending the whole thing had never happened. But then I thought about the grant money they mentioned in the email. The money that could pay for therapies, medical equipment, maybe even future surgeries the kids might need. So I stayed. At 7:15, a stage manager gave me a small nod. "You're up next." The lights on stage were blinding when I walked out. Thousands of faces stretched out across the audience, but I couldn't see any of them clearly at first. Anderson Cooper greeted me warmly and motioned toward the chair beside him. "Dolores," he said, "tell us how this journey began." My heart was racing, but my voice stayed steady. "I was born with several medical conditions," I began. "Club feet, hearing loss. When I was 14, I discovered that my parents had considered giving me up when I was a baby." The room went quiet. I talked about Benjamin next, about the 10-year-old boy who had been rejected by 8 families because people found it hard to look at him. I explained how that moment in the church basement changed everything. "And now," Anderson said softly, "you're raising 8 children." "8 miracles," I corrected gently. Then he smiled. "Well, Dolores," he said, "we have a surprise for you." Before I could react, the curtain behind me opened. All 8 kids walked onto the stage. Benjamin in front, holding Hannah's hand. Elijah waving enthusiastically to the audience. The twins toddling forward with the determined wobble of 2-year-olds who didn't understand why thousands of people were clapping. They ran into my arms. I felt my throat tighten as I hugged them all at once. Then Elijah grabbed the microphone. He had always loved microphones. "Mommy Dolores says we're not mistakes," he said loudly. The audience erupted. "We are miracles!" The applause was overwhelming, thousands of people standing, clapping, cheering. For a moment I couldn't see anything clearly because tears had filled my eyes. But eventually, I glanced toward the audience. Row 12. My parents were sitting there. My mother was crying openly, her hand covering her mouth. My sister Victoria was standing, clapping, tears streaming down her face. My brother sat very still, staring at the stage. My father looked like someone had knocked the air out of him. Anderson handed me an envelope. "On behalf of CNN," he said, "we are honored to present you with a grant of $100,000 to support your work." The applause rose again. I took the microphone once more. "This money will go into medical trust funds for my children," I said. "The ones who were once called broken, the ones who were told they were mistakes." I paused. "They were never broken," I said softly. "They were always miracles." The crowd stood again. But the most important moment came later, when the show ended and we walked backstage. The kids were laughing and talking over each other, still buzzing with excitement. Benjamin looked up at me as we walked toward the exit. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yeah? Did you see them?" I knew exactly who he meant. "Yes," I said. He thought about that for a moment. Then he squeezed my hand. "That's okay," he said. "You have us." In that moment, standing in a hallway under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, I realized something I had spent my whole life trying to understand. The people who once made me feel like a mistake had watched the world stand up for the life I built without them. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the daughter they rejected. I felt like someone who had finally found exactly where she belonged. When I look back at everything that happened, I realize this story was never really about revenge. It wasn't about proving my parents wrong, or making them feel the same pain they once caused me. It was about something much quieter and much more powerful than that. It was about choosing love where others had chosen rejection. For years, I believed the words. I grew up hearing that I was a mistake, a burden, something that made life harder for everyone around me. But the truth I discovered through Benjamin, Hannah, and the other children was completely different. Sometimes the people the world calls broken are the ones who teach us what real strength looks like. Sometimes the children no one wants become the very people who save us. And sometimes the family you build with kindness becomes stronger than the one you were born into. If this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you that every life has value and every person deserves to be seen, then I hope you'll stay with us for more stories like this. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel Revenge Tale Network, where we share powerful human stories that remind us what empathy, resilience, and courage truly look like. Because somewhere out there, someone who feels like a mistake might still be waiting to discover they were actually a miracle all along.